Hi Moss 4472 team. In this video I'm going to take you through chapter 2, Risk and Risk Appetite Assessment. Once you have completed chapter 2, you should be able to do the following things. Describe the nature of risk. Classify risk into different risk categories. Determine the quantitative value of risk and explain how businesses can respond to risk. Risk and technology. Technology provides new ways to manage risk while also creating risks related to its use. So technology is like a double-edged sword. On the one hand, it assists us in managing real risk, but on the other hand, it creates risks that hadn't existed before. Can you think of an example of a risk technology assists businesses in managing? And on the other hand, can you think of a risk that technology creates for businesses that did not exist before that particular technology came about? Think about it and we can discuss it in class. The importance of risk. Let's look at some key definitions before we start looking into risk further. So to begin with, we have an unfavorable event. And for the purposes of this class, an unfavorable event is anything that can possibly hinder a business in achieving its goals or something that causes a business losses. So this is something that is obviously negative and impedes the business's objectives and goals. And then we define risk as the likelihood of an unfavorable event occurring. And then we have something called the sweet spot, which is the optimal level of risk taking that yields enough value to make taking a risk worthwhile. So organizations continuously do risk assessments, and risk assessments are proactive risk awareness techniques that identify, categorize, and prioritize individual risks so that companies can leverage their understanding of risk in strategic planning. After risk assessments, management must decide how to manage risks. So if we look at this curve here, this curve varies for organizations because some organizations are innovators and like taking risk, where other times we have organizations that are more conservative and don't want to take any risks at all. Can you think of an example of a firm that has a high risk appetite and a firm that has a low risk appetite? Regardless of the risk appetite of the firm though, this curve will apply to all firms. It's just the levels and the slopes may be a bit different. So here we have a situation where the organization is taking insufficient levels of risk, and what that does is it impedes its possible profit and growth. So the organization could achieve more, but it's not because it's not taking enough risk. Then we have what is the sweet spot level, which is optimal risk taking. So at this level, the organization takes risks that enable it to succeed and grow and flourish, but those risks aren't like daredevil risks. It wouldn't be anything like cliff diving, for example, for a person. Not all of us feel comfortable cliff diving, but most of us are comfortable doing some sort of exercise because we know it's good for our health, both physical health and mental health. And then we have the area here which classifies excessive risk taking, and this is where an organization takes too many risks and is more likely to incur losses than profits because of this type of risk. This is an educated risk. This is basically going and gambling and hoping against hope of winning. Now that we know what a business risk is, Let's learn about applying risks to a business context. Risk identification takes place at as many levels of the organization, all the way down to an individual project. So we start at the high corporate level, looking at the organization as a whole, but we can also assess and manage risk at the project level. When considering risk, organizations need to know where risks exist within their organizational structure. So finding the areas that are risky. And organizations most often consider risk at a business function level. And let's kind of jot our memory and figure out what a business function is. And business function is a high-level business area or department that performs business processes to achieve organizational goals. And sometimes we have more than one business function necessary to complete a single business process. So as we talked about in chapter 1, if we're looking at the acquisition of raw materials for production, we will have a few departments involved. We might have our vendor management department, so our buyers. We will have our production department, the department actually needing the raw materials to convert them to finished goods. And then we have the accounting department that looks at the risk of the consumers and whether or not to extend credit for them. And they are obviously responsible for recording those transactions in our accounting system and collecting payments. So we have multiple departments in that acquisition process. And remember that risks can occur at different levels, from the organizational level to a single event. So risk is everywhere. We all encounter risks. So here is a visual of the different levels of an organizational risk. We have our organization as a whole. So these are risks that impact the entire organization. Then we might have business function risks. So an accounting department, vendor department. So for example, a risk with the buyer department might be that the buyers collude or engage in bribery with the vendor and you are choosing the wrong suppliers because of that. You're not looking at the benefit for the organization, you're just looking at the benefit for the buyers. We might have business process risks, so there might not be enough controls embedded in the process that allows, let's say, buyers to accept bribes. And then business events, so a single transaction. So selling goods to a customer with bad credit and not receiving the money. So, and these risks will influence these risks as well. So it goes down, but it also goes up, up, up. Now let's look at how organizations view risks. Most organizations combine two views of risk to ensure optimal risk management strategies. One view is the portfolio view, and this one examines risk at the entity level. So organizational as a whole, you look at all the risks that exist and prioritize them. And the other view of risk is the profile view. And this one considers risk at a more granular level of a business function, process, or event. So here you're looking at small risks and the risks that occur in a particular process, whereas with the portfolio view, you're looking at the risks that impact the organization as a whole. Now let's look at enterprise risk management. So when organizations look at entity level risks, they can use the knowledge to assist them with the following activities. Risk management can be integrated into the organization's strategic plan. It can be used to assist the internal audit team to determine which audits they should perform, so which areas are the riskiest and therefore should have priority. You can look at reporting risk to the audit committee and the board of directors. So what are the mechanisms of doing this? Risks should be assessed when selecting different projects for departments to prioritize, or even which capital projects to choose. Risk needs to be assessed when designing information systems and data analytic solutions. Risk should be integrated into assessing and designing internal controls. The areas with obviously the highest risk should have controls put into place to mitigate that risk. Risk should be looked at when it comes to meeting regulatory requirements such as financial statement preparation or tax reporting. Risk needs to be assessed when investigating areas for potential fraud. So these are usually the areas where controls could be overwritten or areas where controls are not in place yet. Risk needs to be assessed when creating policies and procedures, and then designing physical security and infrastructure plans. So if you have an office building, you should have some kind of infrastructure and security that only your employees are able to enter the office and not just anyone off the street. And when we look at enterprise risk management, it's a set of tools that looks at identifying, categorizing, prioritizing, and responding to a company's risk. And this is important because risk management is costly, and for most organizations, it is impossible to address all risks. So they just need to be prioritized and identified and categorized. And the most important risks, so the risks that have the potential for the most damage, should be the ones addressed by the organization. So here is a visual of the 4 steps of enterprise risk management. Assessing risk first requires risk identification. So in the identification step, we're identifying existing risks and their potential outcomes. Risk categorization involves categorizing risks based on their types, and this helps to fine-tune risk from entity level to specific business process related risks. Once we have risk categorized, we have to prioritize risk. So in this step, you are selecting which risks are most likely to occur or will have the largest impact on the organization, and prioritizing creating responses to those risks. And lastly, you will need to address risk. So create some kind of a risk response. So you are deciding how the company will address and prioritize risks. Identifying risks. Identifying risk is a worst case scenario exercise. It uses a Murphy's Law approach where anything that can happen will happen. So here you are being bleak and grim and you're thinking, what are the worst things that can happen? And some ways of identifying risks include brainstorming exercises with the team, using data to predict the future from the past, diagramming business processes and looking for weaknesses, and developing assumptions about operations and weaknesses. So there are multiple ways of identifying risk. The key is to have a sound knowledge of the organization and business processes so that you are able to spot any weaknesses that exist. Identifying risks. Organizations need to identify not only what the risk is, but also the possible consequences of the risk. So what will happen? We're at a time where there are fires in Los Angeles, so there is a fire risk, and what will happen as a result of the fire? Winds can spread the fire, buildings will burn down, people will lose their homes, organizations might lose their head offices. The possible consequences of risks make risk management an important organizational activity. So by planning for this worst case scenario, you're able to maybe mitigate the risk, or you're able to have a plan at least in case that risk occurs and you know how to act. Organizations will not be unprepared, and organizations often create risk statements, and these risk statements contain two parts: the issue and the possible outcome. Common keywords in risk statements are because, cause, and possible. This issue may result in this outcome. So a fire may result in our headquarters burning down. A hacker gaining access to our network may result in data breaches, holding our data hostage, etc., etc. So you are looking for what the issue is and the worst possible outcome of that issue. Now that we have identified the risk, we have to categorize it. So the second step of enterprise risk management is categorizing identified risks based on their type. The first step in categorizing risk is to determine where it is coming from. So here we are labeling risk into different categories, and the two main overarching categories are internal risks and external risks. Internal risks occur through a company's operations and arise during normal operations. So these risks come from within the organizations itself, and most internal risks are preventable through careful risk identification and management. Then, on the other hand, we have external risks, and these risks are not related to business operations and come from outside the company. They are not related to business operations. So this is something happening from outside. That fire example that I gave earlier would be an example of an external risk. Organizations can't control nature. It is important to identify the source of the risk because organizations are accountable for all their internal risks. Now let's break down internal risks further into different categories. One such category is operational risks, and these risks occur during day-to-day business operations, and they may cause breakdown in business activities. These risks are priorities for the accounting information system because they stem from inadequate or failed procedures within the organization. So this is errors that the organization is making that create risks. There might be gaps in internal controls, for example. And one subset of operational risk is technology risk. And because this is an AIS course, we are interested in technology risk. So technology risks exist when technology failures have the potential of disrupting the business. They include threats, vulnerability, and exposure of information. Type of technology failures include power outages or poor connections, fraud, cybercrime, security issues, and conditions of the physical equipment. Is the equipment maintained properly? And then we have cyber risk. And this is a unique technology risk that occurs when external third party accesses the company's technological assets and performs unauthorized actions that are malicious. This includes cyber breaches, data breaches, or lockdowns of a company's system that then result in the hacker or intruder holding the company's information for ransom until the company pays a certain amount. There are many examples of this in the media. You can have a look at some of the technological breaches that have occurred. Another type of an internal risk is financial risk. And financial risks involves money going into and out of the company and the potential loss of a substantial sum. This type of risk is associated with financial transactions of various types, including investments, sales, purchases, and loans. And financial transactions create unique risks. So, for example, customers not paying their amounts or vendors taking your money and not delivering goods. And as we know, an accounting information system deals a lot with money and financial information. So it is particularly important to look at financial risk. And this risk can also include investing in certain stocks, maybe long-term investment or even short-term investment. Another type of risk is reputational risk. And reputational risk occurs when the reputation or good name of an organization is damaged. The unique thing about reputational risk is that it can be considered both an internal and external risk. And the consequences of reputational risks include the loss of customers and the loss of revenue. Reputational risk, as I mentioned, can be both internal and external in nature. And it can be classified as internal risk because organizations can reduce reputational risk by implementing appropriate policies, safety procedures, and customer relation initiatives. The popularity of social media, and especially of cancel culture, has increased the importance of reputational risk. So now it is much easier for organizations to encounter reputational damage through online customer reviews and posts. Can you think of any organizations that you are aware of that suffered reputational risk? Now we are moving on to external risks. So one external risk is compliance risk. And compliance risk occurs when a company fails to follow regulations and legislations and is subject to legal penalties, including fines. Failing to comply with regulations can lead to substantial legal penalties, financial losses, and even reputational losses. However, some organizations calculate this risk and see the rewards of breaking laws as higher. So this is something that is always balanced, compliance versus risk. And a lot of risk taking just includes a cost-benefit analysis of what is our profit if we pursue this strategy that's against the law, and what will our penalties be. There are many examples of legal accounting scandals, even environmental scandals that resulted because an organization was taking a risk and perhaps the risk was higher than they initially expected. Another type of external risk is strategic risk. And strategic risk is the inevitable risk that results when a strategy becomes less effective. So the world changes, especially technology changes. So the organizations constantly need to monitor market demands, their business strategy, and adjust accordingly based on what new entrants or competitors are doing. So to stay ahead of their competition, organizations must adopt new technology, overhaul product design. So here research and development is very important, or even change vendors. When a company faces strategic risk, they either adapt or they fail. So you can flourish or flounder. An example of an organization that failed because they didn't adapt their strategy is Blockbuster, that had videos in store. Netflix and other streaming services came, and because Blockbuster didn't adapt, they perished and they're no longer a company. Then we have physical risks, and physical risks are threats such as adverse weather conditions. That fire I mentioned earlier would be a physical risk, crimes, or even physical damage to the organization's headquarters, key players, etc. And it is important to identify physical risk because it usually has a very high impact. So many organizations think about the climate and geography of various locations before they pick their headquarters. And even cloud computing companies think about such things when they set up their servers, those server farms. Once a company has identified all the risks it faces, it needs to categorize those risks and compile a risk inventory. And for the purposes of our course, a risk inventory is a list of all the organization's known risks. Risk inventories allow enterprise risk management teams to map risks to business objectives, business processes, and one another. So once you have a comprehensive list of risks, you're able to then group those risks and determine what level of the organization do they pertain to and what is their importance. We have discussed on how to identify risks. So now we're going to move on to how to prioritize risks, because it is absolutely impossible for organizations to address all the risks they face. So prioritizing risk is a crucial step because organizations don't have unlimited resources. As a result, organizations must determine which risk resources should be allocated to address. So which resources are you allocating to address which risks? And part of this process is to evaluate risk severity. And risk severity is the likelihood of risk occurring and their potential impact on the organization. And when we discuss the likelihood portion, likelihood is the estimated probability of risk occurrence, also referred to as frequency or probability. So what is the likelihood that this risk will happen? Is it high? Is it low? Is it medium? And then we have a risk impact, and this is the estimation of damage that could be caused if a risk occurs. And this is also referred to as the risk magnitude or the consequences of the risk. And both likelihood and impact are measured on a scale from high to low. Here we have an example of this scale. We have a high risk level, a medium high risk level, a medium low, and a low. And these risk levels are equation that multiplies likelihood by impact. As I mentioned, many organizations have risk equations or risk numbers, and these are calculated by using risk formulas. So when we evaluate risk, the qualitative method is first used to assign likelihood and impact, and then we will take a step and use a quantitative method to calculate a risk score to each risk. And this is probably because we're accountants and we enjoy numbers, so we're better looking at risk as a numeric value versus as a wording of medium high or medium low. A point value between 1 and 5 is applied to the likelihood and impact rankings, with 1 being the lowest and 5 being the highest. You can calculate the final risk score by multiplying the two numbers together. Risks with similar risk scores may be treated differently based on the management's judgmental decision making. So management might prioritize certain risks over others, even though they may have the same risk score. And this is always related to resources and the amount the organization has to invest in risk management. And each organization has a different approach to calculating risk and managing risk as well. Here is an example of a risk likelihood scale and how management might assign a risk score. So for example, if we have a high risk level, that would constitute a score of 5. And this usually means that the risk is imminent and the actual occurrence percentage is greater than 15%. So it is greater than 15% that this risk will occur. Then we have medium high risks, which get a score of 4. And these risks are probable, so it is within 10 to 15% that they occur. This is just a guideline. There are other scales and numbers, so don't feel constrained by this, but this is just an example of what a risk score would mean and how it's related to a risk category, a risk level, and a percentage of occurrence. A similar approach can be taken for the impact risk scale and what it means. So similarly, the higher the risk, the higher the impact score. A 5 would be considered detrimental. So here we have a significant financial impact loss of greater than 50 million. Please remember that these numbers are organization specific. If you have a company that only earns 1 million a year, that 50 million obviously does not work for it. It would be probably something around 500,000 instead of 50 million. So always adapt these types of scales to the organization that you are analyzing. Same thing with customers. If an organization has 20 customers, they'll never reach a high impact score if you keep this one, because this is an organization, or this scale or score belongs to an organization that has more than 10,000 customers. So use your judgment and discretion, please. One useful tool that organizations use are risk matrices, and a risk matrix helps paint a clearer picture of the risk than just a number like the risk score we discussed, because it enables users to visualize variations in risk score. So these matrix put all the risks on this kind of a heat map, And risk matrix allow management to plot risks and then prioritize them. This heat map is a type of a risk matrix that uses different colors to represent values of data in a map or diagram format. The different colors in a risk matrix heat map represent the priority of a risk based on the score. Green, so the green risks here, would have low priority, and red risks would have the highest priority. And heat maps provide a holistic big picture view of risk. The area that organizations will differ here is these risks, because they require judgment and a look at the organization's perspective. So are you going to look at medium, high, and medium low versus medium low and medium high, right? So you're looking at the impact and probability, and which one do you prioritize? That is something up to management's judgment. Now that we know how risks are mapped out and prioritized, we're going to look at how organizations respond to risk. Risk management is a very complex part of the business. It requires critical thinking and decision-making skills to understand the entire situation and to come up with the appropriate combination of risk responses. Accountants are qualified for risk management because of our training in business processes, risk identification, and holistic business operations. Organizations determine their risk response based on the risks that they face. When selecting a risk response, organizations must consider their risk appetite. And risk appetite is the amount of risk a company is willing to take on at a particular time. So this is their kind of sweet spot. What is their risk level? And they will build their risk strategy around their risk appetite. If you feel that I didn't introduce enough classifications or definitions, here's another way to classify risks. Risks can also be classified by their nature, and these are the different types of risks. We have inherent risks, and inherent risk is just the natural level of risk in a business process or activity if there are no risk responses in place. So this is kind of your base level of risk. It is risk before implementing a risk response. And inherent risk consists both of likelihood and impact. So you can calculate a risk score for your inherent risk. Then we have residual risk, and this is the remaining risk posed by a process or activity once a plan to respond to the risk is in place. It is the risks after implementing the risk response, and organizations usually establish a residual risk target, and this target is based on their risk appetite. Then we have our target residual risk, and this is the goal risk level after implementing a risk response. And then we also have actual residual risk, because we know reality doesn't always conform to plans. And this is the risk remaining after the risk response. So what actually happens, your target is your goal and what you're hoping for, and your actual is your actual. So it's kind of like your budget versus actual results. Your target residual risk is your budget, and your actual residual risk is your actual results, what happens. So once you know your target risk, you can develop a response for each individual risk. So organizations determine their risk response by calculating the residual risk of the response. and there are 4 responses to risk. One is to just accept the risk, do nothing. If the risk is low, you can just live with it and not alter anything within the organization to address the risk. Another response is to avoid the risk. So for example, if you know that a certain region is experiencing political turmoil, you might just avoid selling or locating your office into that region. So the risk never materializes because your organization isn't headquartered there or selling there. You could mitigate the risk, and this is where internal controls come into place. They are strategies to mitigate risk. They will never 100% take away risk, but they make the risk more bearable. So for example, if you have a risk of theft within the organization, you might install security cameras, you might have all your valuable goods in a sealed off area. For example, when I worked in mining, we had a precious metal refinery where all the gold, palladium, rhodium, platinum, all those very, very expensive precious metals were being stored. So anyone who entered that facility would be weighed upon arrival and weighed upon departure. There were cameras, there was restricted access just to mitigate the risk of someone stealing something. Or risk could be transferred, and we transfer risk to a third party. Most people who own a home have an insurance policy, so in case of a flood or a fire or even, a burglary, you are protected and the risk is transferred to the insurance company. We pay premiums, for example, with our car insurance in case of an accident. So we pay monthly just in case something happens so that we do not have to worry. So here's a slide just about risk acceptance. Risk acceptance occurs when an inherent risk is present, but the organization chooses not to act. Sometimes a risk is small or unlikely to happen. Other times a risk may be large or likely to happen, but the organization has limited resources and faces other risks that are more important to prioritize. The next strategy is risk avoidance, and risk avoidance eliminates the risk by completely avoiding the events causing the risk. An organization is often unable to completely avoid risk and will choose to partially avoid the risks while using an additional risk response for what it can't avoid. Then we have risk mitigation, and risk mitigation enables organizations to take on risks in order to create competitive advantage. Reducing risks requires careful consideration and calculation. This is the most common risk response. By mitigating risks, organizations decide to accept risk, but to minimize its impact in the event that it occurs. Organizations mitigate risk internally by implementing methods or procedures that affect business processes and activities, or by using other mitigating tools to reduce risks. As I mentioned, internal controls and a strong internal control system is one way many organizations mitigate risk. And then risk can be transferred. Risk transfer involves shifting a risk to a third party. By transferring risk, a third party assumes the liability for the risk. This risk response usually comes with associated costs. Organizations can minimize residual risk through a combination of risk responses. However, there will always be residual risk. Risk management is deciding how much residual risk is acceptable and what combination of risk responses will be most effective at achieving this risk level. That is it for chapter 2. I look forward to your questions and seeing you in class. Have a great day. Bye.